Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for the November edition of our Sooner, Safer, Happier meetup. It's lovely to have you here. And as many of you will, if you follow any of my posts on LinkedIn, you'll know how super excited I am to welcome Jabe Bloom. But full disclosure, this is the first time really Jabe and I have interacted in a sort of like where we can see each other's faces properly and so on. I've just been someone who's sort of stalked Jabe online and talks and all that for a good long while. I'm an absolutely massive fan, so that's why it means so much to me. And recently you might have seen that I posted up online a link to the Profound podcast hosted by John Willis that Jabe appeared on, and I think everyone should listen to that. It's absolutely fantastic. But there was a line at the beginning where John said, and I will reiterate it, that when Jabe speaks, everyone in the audience's IQ raises. But it also did make me think about that interesting notion that the more you know, the less you know. So it's a particular sort of, and then I got onto wordplay. So it's listening to Jabe is like a tonic, but it's also toxic from the perspective of it's quite intoxicating. So it's dizzying, and I'm so happy to welcome Jabe here to speak to us on the subject of transition design and transition in organizations, but this fabulous notion of ReCommoning. I think I know what it might mean, but I searched everywhere for a definition on Google and couldn't find one, so I'm not going to embarrass myself and try and explain it before Jabe does. So without further ado, I will hand straight over to Jabe now, and thank you, Jabe. Please take center stage.
Thank you guys so much for having me, and such a kind introduction. I really appreciate it. It is a passion of mine to work with people to understand these ideas, and I think it has a lot of these ideas and a lot of stuff we're working on. As a community, I love to encourage people to think that it's important for the work that we do at work in our businesses and for transitioning our businesses to more successful and profitable places to work, happier places to work, all those things. But I am relatively unapologetic about also encouraging people to think that these ideas are important in the wider world for transitioning towards more sustainable ways of living, more sustainable societies. And with kind of, the climate conference happening right now, these are specifically the things that I would start pointing to as learning how to do these things at work is part of learning how to shift and transition at a greater scale, even outside of work. So with that, let me see if I can show you this. Does that work for everybody? Everybody see that?
Yeah, super.
So I'm going to try today. I will point out some things where you guys can go and watch something about the three economies, which I'll talk about briefly, and a talk that I did with Demeje around ReCommoning in particular. I'd like to go through some of that stuff at pace today, and then try to push some new ideas that I've been playing with. So things that you won't be able to hear anywhere except here right now. I think it'll be fun. It'll be interesting. Part of the result of that will be that I think the beginning of the talk will be pretty standard coherent, and then I'm going to jump around slides And then I'm going to try to leave some space for questions and answers at the end. I'm happy to stay as long as y'all are happy to hang out. So the end is up to you guys and the organizers. But that said, unfortunately, I occasionally have to, or I have to do this often now due to some unfortunate events in the past. Just very quickly, the work that you're seeing is part of my dissertation, which has not been published yet. And if people publish these ideas in other places without giving me appropriate attribution, it can cause problems with my dissertation. I am encouraged by my dissertation committee to disseminate these ideas. In fact, it's part of the criteria for my successful defense. So it is good for you to use them. Please just put my name on the bottom of the slide if you choose to use the slides anywhere. That's really what I'm saying. Welcome to my PhD. I hope you enjoy it. So let's just start with this like really brief kind of overview. What is the commons? Like, what is commons? What is the commons? So the commons comes from a set of ideas about how resources are owned and shared in economics. And traditionally, people have heard maybe from a perspective called the tragedy of the commons, which we'll get to in a minute. But in general, the way we can kind of describe something that is in the commons is that it has two particular types of attributes. One is that what is in the commons, what is held in common, has a quality called subtractability, which means that left ungoverned, it could be completely consumed and go away. In other words, it would be bad for everybody who relied on that thing because it could go away. And the second thing that tends to be kind of judged as kind of the other quality of commons is control of access or control of participation. So there's two things. We have some sort of resource that we can control the access to, that gets consumed, but that we share in some way. So that's kind of a basic theory of what is a commons. My good friend, Dr. Anawafa Demeje, says that commons kind of occupy this space between privately held property and public goods. So public goods tend to be like, freedom, rights, things like this, completely intangible. Privately held things tend to be property, resources that are held and only kind of transferred through economic relationships. They are not only resource systems whose over-exploitation leads to depletion, that's the subtraction theory, but commons also includes communities using these resources and social practices that define how the resources are used. That latter half is Demeje's description of how governance or access control is done. And so what Demeje ends up pointing out here is that commoning, or the activity of maintaining a commons, is not simply the resources which are consumed, but include the activities that allow the resources to be maintained by a community. And so, we get these ideas of social practice, knowledge, governance, and interactions between multiple levels of governance. So we'll get it towards the end of this talk. I want to talk about what's called polycentric theory. It's not simply that there is one group maintaining a commons. There's an interaction between multiple power centers to establish and maintain the commons. And then there's this idea of kind of social practice, which we'll get into a little bit, which roughly translates into traditions or ways of working, is maybe some of the kind of ideas that we might mix in there. what are the ways of working involved in creating common shared goods or common shared resources. So that's really briefly commons. So what's the problem? Like if that's the commons, what are we trying to solve for? What is it that we're interested in understanding more about? So traditionally, the commons is presented in a set of traditional economic theory with some what the Ostroms will eventually point out is that these theories are not correct, but there's some assumptions built in to the theory. And the way the tragedy commons works is this: it's often actually presented as a field where you are grazing cows. And the idea here is that all of us here all own cows, and there's some shared pasture in the middle of town that we can take our cows to graze on. And the tragedy of the commons says this: there is a perverse motivator that can get into play that works like this. I decide that everybody else only has one cow on the field. I'm going to put 2 cows on the field and 3 cows on the field. I'm going to keep on increasing the number of my cows on the field. And the reason for this is because I win either way if I do this. I either get more cows and everybody else gives up, and then the pasture is maintained, or the pasture collapses, but I still had more cows prior to the pasture collapsing. So it is a perverse set of motivators that says that every time an ungoverned consumable resource is exposed, that greedy freeloading actors will cause the collapse of the commons. That's what the tragedy of the commons is. Now, there's all sorts of interesting versions of that that are good and bad. One of the things that I like to point out really quickly is that the man who came up with the theory of the tragedy of the commons is a straight up xenophobic anti-immigration person. And his description of the commons was specifically that we should not let more people come into the United States. The United States had commons that would be consumed by immigrants, and that would be bad. So this theory is straight up racist nonsense. But let's explore some of the economics behind it. Keep on going. The tragedy of commons is often kind of explained within the enclosure movement, which happened in England, and the enclosure movement is an attempt to solve for the tragedy of the commons. The idea here is at one point, England had lots of shared pasture space that wasn't centrally governed, wasn't owned by a particular person. And at some point, they decide to maximize the efficiency and productivity of the land. They would enclose it. And what they mean by enclose it is they would give it to particular people to be responsible for managing, with the theory that unmanaged, it wouldn't be efficient. So it needs to have a single person in charge of each plot of land. And that single person then could be judged as to whether or not they were making the land efficient or not. In a diffuse governance pattern, like one where the land was held in common, it would be hard to hold people responsible for the inefficient use of land. So let's enclose it. And that causes what's called the enclosure movement. And basically, the pasture land in the UK gets divided up and gets handed over to the nobility, blah, 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 blah. So this causes something that I like to call the tragedy of enclosure. And the tragedy of enclosure says that there are multiple scales involved in any system. So there's the kind of the whole system, and then there's localities and things like this. And the enclosure theory imagines what's called a monocentric system. It says that one person needs to be held accountable for the whole system. But the argument that is made in polycentric theory is that at multiple scales, the needs are not scale free, they're scale full. So what's scale free? Scale free means that like the way to determine the goodness or badness of the global outcome of a system is to add up the results from all the localities and maximize the result at the whole. And the scale full version says, actually, needs in localities are often different than needs in other localities. And so the whole, if you govern from one monocentric kind of pointy pyramid whole, you almost certainly erase the local needs and maximize the whole system need, yeah, or the kind of most abstract need, often, you know, profit-based and things like this. So localized needs end up getting destroyed. Private concerns destroy common concerns. So the concerns of individual owners override the concerns of the people working in the commons. Practices of self-governance are lost. So there's a de-skilling effect here, where what was held in common and negotiated in common all of a sudden becomes governed by a single source. And therefore, the people who used to know how to negotiate the management of the pasture lose the ability to govern themselves. They don't have the chance to practice those activities. Rationality and data are narrowed to appeal to the owner. So like all of this stuff is, you know, if you guys are involved in any agile transformation where you say decentralizing decision-making, and you say, well, why decentralized decision-making? And people say, well, because the people nearest to the work should be making the decisions, because as the decisions move further away from the people doing the work, then the data gets like, I sometimes talk about it like JPEG compression. I don't know if you guys like, if you recompress a JPEG over and over and over again, the artifacts gets worse. Like every time you move up a layer in an organization, you add all these weird artifacts to the image that make it harder to read, right? So anyway, so all that stuff causes this narrowing of data, these problematics with data. And then that which gains in value by being a common is destroyed. So there's this weird question in there, which is, are there certain things in your organization or in the world that are most economically valuable if they are held in common as opposed to in private? That's an interesting question that we'll kind of get to. So here's a little kind of map to start kind of laying out this stuff and trying to figure out where we are. We have this idea of something consumable, and the thing that the Ostroms don't do, and kind of much kind of commons governance theory doesn't do, is they don't actually, in my opinion, they don't reflect on the opposite side of it. So in the theory that I'm going to show you, we have an idea of consumable things, but then we have an idea of non-consumable resources, which I'm going to point out in a minute. But the idea here is that there's grass, and then there's stuff that's not like grass. It doesn't get used up if you use it. And then there's control or access. So there's this idea of governance, or this idea of no governance, right? And so to lay out the basic map here, the tragedy of commons is, in theory, the interaction between no governance, high access, with a consumable resource. What Ostrom will tell you, if you read Ostrom, is that in that case, with no governance and consumable resources, what will happen is that people will create forms of governance by themselves. They will self-organize around the resources. Again, should sound familiar to an agile people, but that's where that theory lies. On the other side, which is governed consumable resources, we get governance of the commons. This is solidly what the Ostroms are talking about as far as polycentric systems theory and commons in general. On the bottom are a set of what I would call non-consumables and stuff that I have to be careful about the way I say this because I want to be careful about a couple things. But on the bottom is a set of theory that opens up in the case of digital materiality, by which I mean software and virtual objects and things like this, which I would argue are still material, and then I'll stop there. But this side of the graph is opened up because of those things. They're not grass. They are something other than that. The kind of common trope here would be like that one of the things about software is that once you make it, it costs almost nothing to reproduce it, right? So there's something down here that's different than grass. And the two sides of this end up being uncontrolled non-consumable is basically open source. It's open by default. It is an argument that says that there's a reactionary intervention into proprietary controlled systems, the enclosure problem. And the way to do that is to legally make it impossible to enclose the resource. So make it so you cannot enclose the resource. And this is, you get open source, where the openness is access to the resource in a non-proprietary perspective. There's another side of this, which is governed non-consumables, which is what I primarily want to talk about with you guys today, that have to do with ReCommoning. And in governed non-consumables, the easiest way to kind of reflect on this is the difference between open source and inner source. It's the idea of using open source methodologies internally to your organization to create governed but common resources inside the organization. And that is what we call ReCommoning. And that's what I want to talk about. All right. So what does all this nonsense have to do with enterprise IT? Most of you work in enterprise IT, I assume. Why am I ranting about this? There's a massive movement inside of our industry that's related to this right now. And one of the things I would say is this, before I go into the theory too much. A lot of what caused the open source, so like one of the ways to think about open source is to say it wasn't just like an idea somebody had at some point and like made real. It was an idea in a particular context, and the context allowed for the idea to develop, right? So what was that context? The context, I think, was a certain level of complexity of the internet. The internet, the network itself, reached a certain critical level of complexity where people suddenly needed to start using things like standards-based development and a focus on developing infrastructural components at low cost that caused the open source movement to kind of like take off, right? That's the context that it's like beginning in. One of my arguments that I make right now to people is that in your average, in your larger enterprises and your mid-sized enterprises, the level of complexity of the systems that they are now managing and the interactions between those systems and the network and storage, et cetera, is arriving at the level of complexity that the internet was at when the open source movement took off. So what we're seeing right now is not simply transformation because we want to create more business value, et cetera, but in fact, transformation because in trying to create more value, we've created more complexity, and we need to learn how to manage that complexity. And therefore, there's a set of methods and ideas that need to be developed inside of the organization to be able to manage that level of complexity. That's what we're seeing. That's what's driving the transformation. It's the amount of complexity, not again, to me, it's not the speed or reacting faster or anything like that. It's the amount of complexity that we're dealing with that I want to talk about, I guess, is what I would say. So how does that play out? What does that look like? Well, I argue that in any enterprise, they primarily have two different economic theories currently, and only two economic theories, really. The two economic theories are the theory of differentiation and the theory of economic scale. So most people have heard of scale, so let's start with differentiation. Differentiation is very simple. The value of the thing increases by difference. In other words, why would my customer buy my product versus your product? Well, because there's a difference between them. And so how we create value as product teams or in product lines or at the edge of a value stream that touches a customer is we differentiate our offering from other people's offerings. So that is an economic theory that says the way you measure value is by the amount of difference it creates in the market. And so what we're trying to do is measure value created by market addressability. And what I mean by that is, you can see this going all the way back really to the 90s. What we're seeing primarily in product development is an attempt to treat the market as non-monolithic. In other words, there are multiple customer segments, multiple customer types, multiple customer needs, and we're developing separate products, product lines, value streams, whatever you want to call those things, to address those niches inside of the market. So we're increasing the addressability of our system into smaller niches in the market, differentiation. So that's one side. The other side, everybody I think will recognize if they've ever worked in IT, and it's scale, and it's the value created by the efficient operation, purchasing, and deployment of resources. So, every year your IT group is asked to deploy more servers, to deploy more network capacity, more storage, etc., for the same amount of money or preferably less. Yeah. So this is a scale-based play. And the idea here is this, and you can see this play out when you look inside of most IT organizations. What you're looking for is highly repeatable tasks that you can squeeze the waste out of. You should hear lean type things here, so that you can do them over and over and over again with high quality and low cost, right? So that's a scale-based play. So those are the two different economic kind of theories that I generally see. And what we get here is a paradox. We've got one side of the organization, the same organization, one side of the organization arguing that we need to increase the amount of variation. Variety, actually. I should change this slide. There's a very specific reason for this. But one side of the organization is constantly arguing that we need to increase variety, which is just increased difference. The other side is actually saying we need to decrease variation, which is, by the way, subtly different. So the thing to hear is this. One side wants to intentionally create difference. The other side wants to intentionally reduce unintentional differences. They want to reduce variation versus variety. Variety good, variation bad. This confusion in language causes huge fights across organizations all the time because they're not actually pointing at the same thing. But anyway, you get this fight, this paradox. These people are fighting about this. One of the arguments I usually make is this is such a big fight where it's not clear who would win the fight that often organizations just refuse to talk about it altogether because it's not clear who would win. And it makes the problem even worse because you can't even discuss it out loud. So again, you see these kind of things that play out. One side's business line, product lines, BUs, agile feature teams. They focus on autonomy, agility, and ownership. It's basically an enclosure argument. Your scrum master is the person who is keeping people out of your field so that you can appropriately harvest the things that were planted at the beginning of the sprint, right? Enclosure theory. Central IT, we're talking about approved architectures, procurement, availability, capacity planning, and change control, right? Centralized governance is what this is. So you'll notice on both sides of this, both of them are different privatization theories. One is a small privatization theory, and one is a central privatization theory. They're both monocentric theories of how to organize the organization. So one side's trying to get more customers, blah, blah, blah. The other side is trying to control consumption and use best practices. One side is trying to maximize the ability to respond to local variation and adapt to environmental change. The other side is trying to maximize the ability to harvest value from already owned assets and the predictable nature of commodity goods, right? They're fighting all the time about this stuff. So we got a nice paradox here. We got a problem that is happening in almost all IT organizations as far as I'm aware. And we need to solve this paradox, but I'm going to throw in a couple extra ones that I don't usually talk about that I want to talk about really quickly. The first one is that idea of like the edge case of the way that product teams are trying to do this active adaptation, right? And one of the ways to think of this is to say that what we're trying to do is allow the parts of the organization that interact with the market to maximize their freedom so that they can adapt quicker. That's really partly what we're trying to do. The problem is that when we do that in a lot of the frames that we currently use, we have no explanation of how those autonomous teams, which I would argue are not really autonomous, how those autonomous teams are interacting with the rest of the organization. What is our theory of how that interaction works? Because otherwise they would be better like not part of the organization in theory, because if you're going to make them completely autonomous, then you have this like holding company theory where the only value a team has is their ability to like provide you cash, I guess. Like, how is it that these autonomous teams are adding value? And this ends up being a really interesting kind of concept that Polyani explores. And it's called polycentric systems theory. And the way to think about this really quickly is figure one is the idea that all the teams are actually interconnected in some way. All the teams interconnect in some way. And that there's some, every time one team adapts to the market, all the rest of the teams have to kind of like adapt not only to the market, but also to the other team, like the way, so that all the interactions cross. And the second figure two is weird. I always think it's weird because it doesn't make sense to me, but the way to interpret it is that in his metaphor, the lines have elasticity to them. They're not solid. So if you look at the first figure, if it was solids, since they're all triangles, like basic architectural form says triangles don't bend. But anyway, second one, if they're elastic, as you pull on the string, the relationships between all the teams are constantly changing. Yeah. And so the argument here is this, from Polyani's perspective: you cannot optimize the relationships between the network here centrally. The only way to optimize the relationships is decentralizing them. And the way to think about that statement is not to think that they're autonomous teams, but that they're interdependent teams that are capable of local negotiation. And that's critical. The critical difference here between like a top-down theory and this theory is that all the shifting that's happening needs to be renegotiated locally. And therefore, one of the critical components of polycentric theory is the ability for teams to locally negotiate value and relationships. There's some other parts to it that we'll get to, but that's critical. By the way, I think that this is like Conway's law. It's basically what this is, except the difference here when you look at this, and if you understand Conway's law through this lens, one of the things that it would start talking about, I think, and one of the things that people, I think, miss all the time about Conway's law is Conway's law. If you took Conway's law and gave it to a network architect and said, what does this mean? They wouldn't tell you that you need to redesign the routers, the team. They would tell you you need to redesign the network with quality of quality of service interactions to make sure that the right information is traveling across the right networks to the right people. It is a network design problem, is what it is. And so the thing I'm ranting about this for right now is because the massive kind of push in our community to talk about autonomy and to talk about removing dependencies is not wrong, but it also hides the fact that one of the primary problems we have to deal with in the enterprise is the design of dependencies through networks. That's one of the design problems we have. And if we kind of advocate that, we get less optimal results, I guess. And part of the less optimal results part of this is this. A lot of what ends up happening in centrally organized systems is the massive overproduction of what are called externalities. So what is an externality? An externality is if I have a team and I'm doing something, and the short-term outcome of my action will be that my team will advance in their goal. They'll get more value, more points, whatever. But the whole network will have to deal with some bad result, right? Like the trade-off I'm making causes a short-term gain for me and a short-term loss for everyone else. That's what's called an externality. So like really simple versions of externalities, pollution, polluting streams, smog, all those things that are causing global warming, those are all externalities. And the reason why we want to do like carbon debt and things like that is to make the externalities into not externalities anymore, to have economic impacts on the firms that create the externalities. But the other thing to realize about externalities really quickly is that externalities also describe positive things. Psychological safety, health, low technical debt, all of those things happen to also be externalities. And so if you want to manage those things, you can't manage those things using a monocentric theory because they're externalities. They are network effects. They are not in a team. They are among a team, right? Amongst teams. In the network is what causes those things. So one of the things to think about really quickly is just like technical debt gets there because it's an externality. Because from the, if you want to use the like common version that people use these days of technical debt, from the product owner's view, the short-term benefit outweighs the short-term pain, because the short-term pain is the developer's pain, not the product owner's pain. So what is the product owner doing? They're externalizing the problem. They're taking the value and leaving the problem for someone else to deal with. And so when we kind of talk about things like technical debt, security, psychological safety, all of the illities of architecture are shared common external goods, and they can only be managed through, I think, through a theory of commons, etc. So is there another way to kind of think about this paradox? I'm gonna go into a particular version of it, and then we'll kind of pop back up and talk about externalities and things again. How do we think of this as a resource paradox, though? How do we get back to that? So we described the difference between consumable and non-consumable really quickly, but what can we think of inside of our IT organizations that is like this? What is this like? Well, network, storage, compute, database, all of these things, Moore's law, all the laws that that say that you can consume these things. They can be overconsumed. Yeah. So the central IT, that scale-based economy theory, is good for managing these things. Why? Because you can't give ungoverned access to these things. If you do, for instance, the network is shared amongst all of your teams, give ungoverned access to the network, someone could take the network down for everyone. So bad. So there is a set of consumable resources in the organization. The next question, though, is are there a set of non-consumable things that are not consumed in use? So what I mean by this is, like, are there things where if more people in the organization used them, the value of the things would go up, not down? Yeah. So you can think about it like when a network gets saturated, the value of the network goes down. What are there things that are not like your network? And so these are the ones that I commonly talk about: patterns for configuring and utilizing primitives that limit combinatorial complexity while providing communal resilience. So cloud native patterns like circuit breakers, etc., that if shared widely throughout the organization, if each team adopts things like circuit breakers, etc., it causes a benefit, an externality, often not directly impacting that team, but creates benefit for everyone in the organization by not taking the network down, right? By not overusing some critical resource through a set of patterns. Data. If you had a common data record for your customer that was shared across all the teams, would that make the data go away or get used up? No, it would probably make the data more valuable to have a shared resource. Yeah. So by sharing data across teams, you don't reduce the value of the data, you increase the value of the data. There's subtleties to that. And one of the things I would say is I'm not making an argument against redundancy or duplication. It's not what I'm saying. I am making an argument that you should try to combine things when possible and hold the resulting data in common. So there's some subtleties in there to get to. And the final one is kind of well-factored functions, right? Like shared, this is microservices, etc. These three ideas end up being things that if more people use the same function, if more people use the same data, if more people use the same architectural patterns, the value of the patterns, the data, and the functions go up, not down. And therefore, these are things that would be better managed in common than in private. Why? Because if you have a centralized governance system, the goal is to minimize consumption. So the whole structure is designed to slow consumption down. If you have a privatized goal, a differentiation thing, the whole goal is to not share at all. It doesn't matter that you're sharing, right? The whole goal is to focus on particular needs. Both these economic theories will cause damage to this economic good. So we need a third economic theory, an economic theory inside the firm that allows us to manage these ideas. And we call that the economy of scope. So we get a differentiation economy, a scale economy, and a scope economy. Scope economies are the thing that sits in between differentiation and scale and causes the interaction to be positive as opposed to negative. I often call it the clutch of the two different economies. So the idea here is this: there's a way in which all three of these economic theories are valuable to the firm. By adding the third scope-based economy into the firm, you then actually can maintain the other two without interfering with each other. So what does this scope economy look like? What does it look like? It looks like a platform. It looks like a platform. That's what it looks like. What we're partially describing is how to create a commons in the form of a platform. And I'm going to point out really quickly here, in the same way that like Jabe pointed out, there's a difference between commons and commoning. There's a difference between platform and platforming. And the thing that I care about is platforming, the activity of reproducing the platform amongst teams, as opposed to the fact that you have like purchased some new, used to be that like WebSphere was your platform. That's not the platforming I'm talking about. I'm talking about the way that resources are shared the process for that. So what is ReCommoning? ReCommoning is based on the idea that if you only have two economic theories in your firm currently, and you accept the third theory, the scope theory, is valid, it means that almost certainly there are resources in your firm that are currently being managed by an economic theory that is disadvantageous to the value of that resource. In other words, some of the things that are in differentiation would be better managed in a scope-based economy. And so there's a process or a thing that needs to happen in the firm where we go around to each of the product teams in our firm and say, hey, what are you doing here that we could get more value out of by sharing it? That's the first kind of version of commenting. The second one is there are things in your scale economy, things that are being centrally governed right now that would be better managed in the commons, in a scope-based economy. So how do we take things that are centrally governed right now and make them more accessible? So often, like things like self-service and things like this would come into play here, ways of making accessible what is currently inaccessible, yeah? Because it's being held behind. So ReCommoning is the activity of establishing a platform or a scope-based economy inside your organization. So platforms can be understood more conceptually as guiding principles that redefine two sides of binary relationships and reveal a middle mass as an opportunity for intervention. A platform can help us recommon resource management through new approaches to negotiation. So the trick here is this: platforms should not be viewed in the traditional linearity of a value stream, where one product team is consuming a service that's offered to them by a third party, because what's happening here is that all of a sudden we shift the lens and we realize the platform's being consumed by multiple teams. And by actually asking those teams to begin negotiating and establishing the platform themselves, in other words, self-organizing the platform, that's how we create a commons. And this is a different activity. And it's one that I don't think most organizations understand how to do very well. I think that if you look at things like open source projects, you get closer to this idea, because what we see is this: multiple independent decision centers, multiple product teams, value streams, however you want to describe them, which are given autonomy to make decisions about how to service a particular part of the market, are then being asked to negotiate amongst themselves to create a common resource. These are two different things, and they're a different set of problems. So do we see things like this? Why do we have some reason to believe that this is possible, that I'm not just ranting about crazy things? Yoki Benkler is pretty famous for this book, The Penguin and the Leviathan. It's about the development of Linux. That's the penguin, and the Leviathan is a reference to Hobbes, if you guys do philosophy. And what he found was that people, as long as people believe that the system around them is fair, they are naturally cooperative and they naturally want to interact with other people in a fair way. It's about 80% of the population, he finds. About 20% of the population are avaricious. In other words, they're freeloaders or they try to take advantage of the system. And what he found through his research was that as long as the system is being governed fairly, in other words, the freeloaders are being confronted about their freeloading activity, people will continue to try to collaborate as much as possible. If, however, the freeloaders are seen to be getting away with it, in other words, they are allowed to freeload, the system flips. everybody goes, oh, well, the rules of the game must be to cheat. So I'm going to cheat too, because that's fair. So this is basically an argument that says that set up correctly with appropriate governance, self-organization is a natural way that humans interact. It's not humans are not greedy by nature, is what his argument is. You can see this in kind of open organization and the ideas of open organization around how to apply the ideas of open source, pointing at the resource, open source, to how do we open organization? How do we organize ourselves in an open way? How do we apply the theories of open source to the organization itself, which maybe is partly what I've been ranting about. And the idea here is to say that organizations that create participative communities are more likely to recognize opportunities, be able to react quicker and access resources and skills if they do that. Jim is talking here about open as being kind of cross organizations, but one of the ways to think about this statement is inside your organization, if you develop this capability, multiple product teams are more likely to learn from each other. They're more likely to recognize opportunities based on that. They're more likely to have access to resources and skills that are needed in a crisis because they've already built the interactions between their teams. Cameron Duncan-wise, whether a physical location, online, or a combination, a platform convenes a background research, tools, and appropriate people, allowing focused work on problem solving or innovation with particular communities around particular themes. One of the ways to think about your platform and the activity of platforming is a way of framing or enabling or creating the enabling conditions for your differentiation and innovation teams to work. By the way, I also think it minimizes the complexity that your operators have to operate. So that's another advantage. So one more rant, and then I will stop. I think I have 7 minutes. Is that right, Matt? Roughly 7 minutes to 1/2 the hour.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I was on mute, listening attentively.
So I want to explain really quickly why this is critical from kind of like a complexity and flow theory, right? Because a lot of us in IT have adopted agility, flow line, value stream, theory of constraints ideas. I know, for instance, will I be able to do it? Safer, faster, better, happier. I got the wrong order, but the book talks a lot about flow and value streams. Yeah. And so I want to talk about why what I'm talking about is subtly different and how it interacts with some of those problems. Because I would argue that book plus Project to Product and some of the other books that we're seeing that are popular in the industry right now, where we are seeing a massive realignment towards value streams, towards product lines, towards these things. What are the problems that are going to happen with that, or what do we need to think about, or how do we interact with a platform, or not independency but interdependencies among teams as we move to these systems, right? So traditionally, we see organizations organized into silos around functions, the functionalization of the system, and the whole value stream argument is that we should, in fact, move towards flow-based value streams that cut across the functions, and they don't simply, hand things from one function to the other, and maybe flow in a value stream. From my perspective, at least, as a theory of constraints type person, is like you should identify bottlenecks or constraints in the value stream and focus efforts on the removal of or the management of the constraint, right? So subtle variation there. Lean might say remove all the waste from the value stream. Theory of constraints would simply say Yeah, that's useful, kind of, maybe, but more importantly, manage the constraint, figure out where the flow is getting choked if what you're trying to do is increase flow. So, when we talk about this, we end up with this weird idea from Goldratt that says that if you don't manage the entire value stream as a whole, you are almost certainly going to create a suboptimal system or inefficient system. If you allow each part of the value chain to optimize for its own operation, what you get is a massively inefficient system as opposed to a massively efficient system. In fact, often causing, lower flow, causing higher utilization of the constraint. In the goal, basically, the illustration here is the pile of materials in front of the bottleneck, the machine that is required to process the materials. If the pile of materials is constantly growing, it means that the system upstream from the machine is creating more output than the constraint can consume, and you're basically creating more pressure on the constraint. So that's a bad thing. Anyway, so what we're seeing right now again is not just one value stream, but multiple value streams, right? So lots of organizations, not just one product stream, not just one value stream, multiple product streams. I noticed in the book, by the way, that in the book, there's a description of value streams having multiple products. And in product line theory, that's called a product family. So it's a weird mismatch or like weird mashup to me in the theory, like a value stream versus a product line. There's some weird things to differentiate there, but anyway, so we end up with this multiple product lines flowing across, right? And so what we can see if we look at this with traditional eyes, with traditional value stream eyes, is we would end up looking for bottlenecks in each value stream or in each product line. We would look in different places. Maybe each product line would have a bottleneck in a different place. It would maybe not even be in the same place. So our fears of complex systems drive us to dissect complex systems into subsystems, leading to diverting management attention to chase local optima, which are not in line with the global objective. So is this that? Are we using value streams to create subsystems that allow management attention to be diverted? Interesting question. So maybe a platform is actually where the bottlenecks need to be managed across the value streams. Maybe there is a level at which the platform is literally the activity of managing constraints inside multiple value streams instead of a single value stream. So what we end up asking is, what are common capabilities, common components, common resources? What is common across the value streams that needs to be managed in order to increase flow? And then how do we create a platform to enable that common capability, component, et cetera, in order to increase flow? Flow in networks as opposed to flow in lines is what we're talking about. That there's a network problem here, not simply a line problem. And so what we can see is that is done correctly. If we manage this correctly, we shift complexity forward. In other words, we allow for very simple primitives to be managed by operations and IT. We establish a predefined way of combining those primitives into what we might call platform services, using common patterns of configuration. And then we push the complexity forward, where complexity here means differentiation, the ability for the customer needs and the applications to diversify and consume these things. So that's the goal, is we want to shift this complexity forward. Unfortunately, what we see when things are mismanaged is that if it is too difficult to adopt the platform, what ends up happening is not that the needs are not met, but the complexity of each need is driven back into IT, increasing the operational burden by basically having people avoid adopting the platform while continuing to insist that they have access to the primitives, right? I insist that you give me the primitives. I will configure them however the hell I want, and I'm not going to share my results with anybody. Meaning that each value stream ends up creating more and more complexity inside of IT operations, which is by definition attempting to reduce as much complexity as possible. This problem of trying to get platform adoption to work in order to cause the right shaping of complexity across IT and product teams, this is the biggest bottleneck we have right now. And it's one of the bigger problems I think we need to be able to address as a community. As a result, what we get is this, the ability for teams to shift complexity forward while pulling stabilizing forces backwards towards IT and the platform. And the way to think about that, in my mind, is a harvesting metaphor. So everybody likes to use the gardening metaphor for product, but one of the things to think about is the platform team or the teams that you have working on platforming shouldn't simply be providing a service to the teams. They should be actively working with the teams to identify, hey, that thing that you just built, there's like 3 other teams right now trying to build something like that. I want to harvest that from you, put it on the platform, make it accessible, and increase the adoption of your technology across the organization. The last part of this is this, and then I'll stop. I promise. I've been talking for a while. If we can do this correctly, then we can start moving from what are, in most organizations, essentially a portfolio of value streams or a portfolio of product lines, where each product line is thought of as being the terminus or the end of something, and therefore is managed individually as a portfolio of products towards an integrated set of products that allow people to have user journeys that don't simply cut across functions, but cut across products, so that the products themselves are interacting, and your customers in your organization don't have an experience of each individual product essentially being a separate entity inside your organization, and have instead a experience of flow and fluidity across your product lines. And that should be our long-term goals. I'll stop ranting. I hope there are some questions maybe. Thank you for listening for so long.
Thank you so much, Jabe. My brain's awash. So there's a huge amount to think about that. I mean, one of the things that lots of things sprang to mind as you were going through that. There was a heck of a lot to take in and try and relate to my experience in an organization. But one of the things I was trying to think of, we run experiments in organizations to try and see outcomes or see something that is different from what we had before or what we had in mind. How would an experiment run in this type if we were trying to get these network effects instead of like specific outcomes, but actually just to notice network effects?
So there's an idea in design theory. It's not always the most common one, but Josh Karevsky does a version of it as well that I like, and it's called incremental elaboration. And one of the ways to think about incremental elaboration is to think, instead of thinking like, well, let's stop thinking of our SDLC as a set of gates and think of it as a set of stable points of development, okay? And that we want certain types of quality as the software moves further down this path, right? And if we do that, then we can say like, there's a certain kind of quality of code that we would want to test whether or not it works at all. Like, can we get this thing to work? In which case, like tons of unit testing, for instance, of a spike, this would be called an architectural spike, right? Like tons of unit testing in an architectural spike is probably wasteful because it's a spike. We don't know if it's going to work at all. So we should defer the unit testing until we can make sure that we understand that we can actually do the thing. So that's the first stability. Okay, so now, well, would a user want to use this? Is this something a user would use? Well, that's another set of stability. It's another level of quality. So we have to add a certain amount of quality to the system in order to make sure that the user can use it, it's accessible, blah, 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 right? The second set of stability that requires another level of quality. Okay, so we've gotten a bunch of people to use this and we've done some experiments and we've validated from kind of a user experience theory that people want to use this. We understand how they're going to use it. Now we want to put it in production. Okay, well, that's another level of quality, right? It's a level of quality where like all of a sudden things like unit testing and blah, 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 those things become really important because part of what we're doing when we put something in production is, in theory, we're getting towards the end of actively developing it. Like we're going to put it there, it's going to sit there for a while. So unit testing and documentation and other forms of quality become important for allowing the system to be stable. And one of the things you might argue is like, it's even important to like start putting metrics and things like that to see the performance of the thing in production. So maybe you also interact with your operators through something like an SLO, an SLA, SRE format to define quality of a production or operable resource. Yeah. So you can see we've got like 3 stages of kind of quality already. Well, the last one is to argue that there's a difference between something being in production for a single team and something being on a platform. There's another set of qualities. And so what you would do is you would then promote from production into platform by harvesting it and increasing and adding those extra qualities. It might be multi-homing. It might be, other forms of monitoring and metricing and things like that. It would probably be a heavy focus on operational burden concerns and things like that, because at the platform level, you can't accept extra burden. So what I would say is, the mistake would be to try to start an experiment in the platform. The thing to do would be to harvest something. So I often say like minimum viable transformation seen in the way that I just described what we're doing. Minimum viable transformation involves the following: at least one or more operations teams, at least one or more platform teams, and more than one product team. All have to sign up to go on the transformation journey if the transformation is towards what I just described. Because the problems of multiple product teams trying to consume a platform while minimizing operational burden on IT and IT operations, those problems only occur when the system is seen as being multiple product teams, platform, and operations. If you take one product team, you don't cause the same sort of problems because you don't have inter-product team problems. If you only talk about the platform, you're still not there, blah, blah, blah. And so I really think, like one of the things that I have been trying to encourage people to think about recently is Agile seen from the viewpoint of products is useful for the differentiation economy. To do these transformations is not to apply that to the rest of the organization, but to understand how the interactions of these different systems work. So
a bit like ACOF and the car.
Totally.
Only know it's the car that you want, the car that you need, the car that you'd hope for if you can see it all together in concert, performing what it was there, what you intended it to do.
That's right. Yep. It's the whole where, again, people hate this, right? People really don't like this. ACOF and Goldratt, both of them would say that to have a optimized whole almost certainly means subordinated parts. It means that the parts are not operating to their full capability because they're in relationship to each other. And the relationship at the whole is not fully optimizing the parts. Yeah, it's different. And getting that balance is important. But that's, again, that polycentric theory where I was talking about the multiple ongoing negotiations between the parts. The trick here is to not hear the whole as being centralized control. How do you decentralize? How do you empower the parts to negotiate a better whole? Not how do you make a bunch of autonomous teams and hope you get a better whole? How do you get the parts to negotiate to create a better whole? That's the question. And I don't think that's really well thought in most places. I think the autonomy, the independence of teams, those types of arguments are not well taken sometimes.
Yeah, brilliant. But there are a couple more questions.
Yeah.
I'll probably ask you these two questions, and then we've been told off before sometimes by our audience that we've kept them for too long because it's all been riveting. But so what I'll go to, there's one from Rasmus and one from Carl. I'll go to Rasmus's first because he's got a bunch of votes on there to put this one to you. So Rasmus asks, how can we convince the business product differentiation side to progress to platform economy? Traditionally, they would see this as losing control, uniqueness, existence if they see their work as being platformed.
Yep. So I think that there's two tricks to this. The first is to understand that the platform argument should not be made from a redundancy argument. In other words, you shouldn't be saying that this is an effort to dedupe the environment. It's not about consolidating. It's not about centralizing. Yeah. If you take that primary argument, you'll get arguments like you're not going to need it. Build it and they will come. All of those traditional failures of platform become part of the problem. Right. That's the first thing. The second thing is this: platform teams should be primarily measured on adoption rate. Their primary success criteria should be adoption. The team should be informed that it does not matter how much functionality we put on the platform. It's not a container race. It's none of those things. What it is an adoption race. How many people can use the platform, have adopted the new functions and things like that. So the goal should be to lower the barrier to entry onto the platform as much as possible. How you do that? There's a couple ways. One, there's a terrible tendency inside IT right now to disgorge the requirement pieces. So it used to be like if you wanted a server, you'd fill out a form, and then some project manager would spend the next 2 weeks in hell, like filling out a dozen other forms and a bunch of meetings and nonsense they'd have to go to get you your server. Well, for some reason, people think self-service means getting rid of the project manager and not solving any of those process problems. So what ends up happening is that your developers are now exposed to a bunch of nonsense to get access to something. So you really have to think about, how do I minimize the cost, the effort for each team to get onto the platform, minimize the noise, probably policy re-engagement is one of them. So that's developer experience type stuff. the product owners, the business people that you're describing, you have to convince them that what you will do if they play games, if they play the game, is you will accelerate differentiation by allowing their teams to focus on their customer needs. And what you say to them as much as possible is, my bet is this: your team currently is focused on developing things that are not specific to your customer. Please let me take that work away from your team so that they can focus on the unique differentiated functions that have to do specifically with your customer, because that will accelerate differentiation. So one of the ways I try to explain it sometimes is to say, the platform team must explain themselves in the economic logic of the consumer, the differentiating team. If they can't explain how they're going to accelerate the economic value that team thinks is economically valuable, differentiation, you'll get resistance every time. It's not from their perspective, they will never care if you tell them it makes the organization more efficient. You can't make that argument. You have to make the argument that by doing this, we accelerate your ability to focus on your customer.
Super. Sorry, I just thought
I have two monitors, and all of a sudden you guys are over here. It's all good.
Yeah, sorry. And then I'd said I'd ask Carl's question. Carl, do you want to? Carl Scotland, would you like to ask?
Yeah. Hi, Jabe.
Hey, man.
Hey, good to hear you rant again.
Oh, it's lovely.
So couple of connections that popped into my head while you were talking. One was around your three economies and Wardley's evolution scale. And I guess, similarities, differences you see there, and then similarly your view on platforms and the team topologies kind of take on platforms.
Yeah, so I'll do the team topologies one first. I love the team topology book. It's great. The thing that I think is different than what I'm arguing and what they're arguing is the activity of platforming, to me, is a collaborative activity. And my reading of and my understanding of what they're trying to say is that the platform provides service to the teams. It's not a collaborative activity, it's a service providing activity. And one of my arguments actually that I have in my long deck that I didn't get to is, I actually think that we're seeing the project to product movement, right? Like this idea where not projects, products, long-standing, value-based, blah, blah, blah. Well, in central IT, services are the same economic frame. They're transactional, they're funded, service is moving to platform. The idea of what was an ITIL-based service, completely isolated, I take the risk, you take the reward, you pay me for that. Like all those transactional metaphors that occur in product and in service are changing. And so I would argue that actually the movement in platform is from service to platforming and commoning and the co-creation. And so that's the thing that I think is missing there. Now, mind you, if you don't have a platform team at all, as described in the team topologies group, you don't have anybody to collaborate with anyway. So it's a good stepping stone towards the type of things that I would point to. Wardley's theories around kind of evolution, again, I think I'm describing economic theories and not so he does, settlers, town planners, pioneers, whatever, which are sociological theories. And I'm trying to do economic theories because I think the economic theory, like taking a page right out of Reinertsen, right? Like we should be having economic arguments in business because that's what makes business people understand us. And so it's attempting to frame some of the ways in which software moves around the organization in economics, first of all. And second of all, I actually think that even in ReCommoning, the idea here is that there's a backwards movement of, from central to the platform that you don't see expressed well in a Wardley map. And there's a couple like subtleties around. I think that the three economies focuses on points of stability within the firm, as opposed to the flow of software across a marketplace. So it's like more of it, almost like more of an internal view of how software is created than a market-based view. The markets are on the edges of the three economies.
So would that be fair to say then it's like an economic rationale for why you might move left or right on a Wardley map?
Yep, I think you could argue that, right? Cool. And it's also like, what you could learn from your Wardley map are things like, I think that the scope economy primarily is concerned with, so here's the other weird part about it, is this Wardley doesn't have a tempo theory in my mind. Like he's got a time theory, but it doesn't have a tempo, like there's no cycle in his theory. There's no tempo. There's like, and there's moments of wonder where things start again, but it's very linear. It's not, there's no circle, right? And so my argument with differentiation and scope in particular, which are actually where, if you look at it, that's the primary places in the theory that touch actual economies. One of the other problems when these two economic theories touch have to do with the market cycle times. So in a scope economy, it's really critical that if you're like buying servers or storage or network or stuff like that, you don't want to over purchase or under purchase because of the way that Moore's law, et cetera, works. If you over purchase, you will be punished by the market because you'll be able to buy the same capacity for half the amount of money in a year and a half. So there's a pressure there about the timing of deploying new resources into the firm. And therefore, there's also a pressure inside of IT to get people to consume the new resources, right? So to get the flow and the cycle of the most value I can extract from the current commodity marketplace into the firm is partially about establishing a cycle time that's primarily driven by market economics that I think are probably larger than any one firm, right? The other side, however, differentiation economies, the cycle time there is actually more about kairotic time or opportunity, which means this: it's not about how fast, it's about whether or not your hands are tied behind your back. In other words, I need to be able to not only do I need to be able to punch fast enough to hit the target, I need to be able to punch when there is a target. And so when these two cycle times get entangled on each other, part of the complaint that you'll hear inside an organization is the differentiation teams will literally say, I can't be upgrading Oracle right now. I have a market window I have to hit. You're entangling an opportunistic cycle time with a highly deterministic market-driven cycle time. And the platform is a way of disengaging those cycle times so that they can spin in their own spaces. And the platform is one of the, or the scope economy is one way to do that. So those are some of the differences I would think through.
Cool. Thank you.
Welcome. It was great to see you again.
Yeah, and you.
Brilliant. I think we'll have to call it a day there, Jabe, although I know you could go on and we could go on for much longer. I definitely think this this video, when we put it out there, is going to get a lot of views, if only from me rewatching and having more and more of it sink in. It's been absolutely phenomenal.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
I really appreciate everybody listening. I hope to hear from everybody soon. It was nice to see everybody. Someday I'll get back over there to England again too.
I'll get you down Brighton, lean out of Brighton one day.
Yeah. Soon.
Okay. I'll stop the recording now. And so it's goodbye from us. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.